Hi everybody, this is Nahaz, and I'm going to do something a little different this week. I started to record an episode of Stats Don't Lie a little bit earlier and realized that the subject matter this week I wanted to talk about was a bit different. So we're going to try a different format. I'll call it Esports Economist for now, which is a bit presumptuous, but for lack of a better term, I'm going to steal that right now. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the issues surrounding the drama, and I am not looking to create further drama, and most importantly, I'm not looking to lay blame at anybody's feet. So if you want to hear Puppy or somebody else get flamed, there's plenty of that already on Reddit. I don't feel the need to add to it. I feel a lot of it is misguided anyway. We're going to talk from an economist point of view about some of the issues right now in the Pro Dota 2 scene, because I do believe that they are systemic. We've seen this in the past. It's going to keep happening. The stakes are only going to get bigger as time goes on, and I am concerned at this point that it represents a potential obstacle for growth in the scene. So let's kind of lay out the basic facts. Earlier this week, and again, the links to the various blogs referred to are on this page. The idea here is to give you a short summary in case you haven't already read it. I am not vouching for any of the accuracy of these facts. This is simply what's in the blog, what's been alleged. So Eternal Envy had a quite lengthy blog detailing secrets, delays in some of the tournament payments. The minimum duration seems to be over 3 months, in some cases about a year. At one point, Misery was supposedly owed almost $200,000 by the team and actually contacted an attorney for help in recovering those funds. Envy also alleges, and it seems to be backed up quite well in the blog, that Secret took a 10% cut of tournament prize winnings without knowledge or consent, or prior consent anyway, of the players. It was also revealed, I actually happen to know this through personal contacts, but this was a surprise to a lot of people, that for most of their tenures with the team, Secret players were not paid a salary of any kind. It was all based on tournament prize pool winnings, and players did not receive many of the benefits apparently that they were promised from some of the sponsor deals. Envy refers specifically to an NVIDIA graphics card and alludes to some other things. Misery released a blog later on that same day that appeared to confirm many of the broad details. Now, Misery's blog does not have numbers in it. It's a lot shorter, but it does appear to confirm the broad fact pattern that Envy laid out, including the fact that Misery was owed a lot of money and had to contact an attorney personally in order for help get help recovering some of those funds. Of course, there's been some obvious allusions to a situation that arose earlier last year with Team Secret. This was much earlier, of course, in the team's lifetime. But OG's current manager, Evany, released a blog saying that No Tail and Fly were owed large amounts of prize money by the team, and that they had to take similar, rather extraordinary steps in trying to get that money back. There were really no hard dollar amounts given in that circumstance, to my knowledge, but the amounts were, I've been told that the amounts were somewhere in the 5 figures. So this is not a trivial amount of money. And again, one of the concerns here is that we're going from 5 figures now to amounts involving 6 figures and potentially more, when Envy is talking about some of the deals with Panda, with the Panda TV service in his blog, and those terms not being clear. So I will say that I'm a little worried this time that the same thing is going to happen as last time. Last time, it seemed to be that the fallout in the community after the Evany OG or Evany No Tail Fly incident was to place most of the blame on Cyborg Matt. I thought that was grossly unfair. I said that at the time. And it seems like in this case, a lot of the community is out to place the blame squarely on Puppy. And that may or may not be fair. I don't think it is. My experience, guys, in these kinds of situations is that there's typically plenty of blame to go around. It is typically not reasonable. Although a lot of people like to do it, including in our media, it's not reasonable to make one person the bad guy in situations like this. My concern is more with the system. And when I look at an issue like this, especially as an economist, my approach is to try and figure out what we can do to prevent things like this happening again. So let's talk a little bit about that. This is a little bit obvious, but I do want to talk about this basic issue and why it's a problem, beginning with the observation that this is not something new. Obviously, it had happened before with this particular team, but we've heard of it happening with other teams. We've heard about it happening with tournaments not paying out. And I've thought it's been a potential bombshell for a long time. Contracts between players and teams, when they even exist, and we're talking specifically about the Dota 2 scene now, are very highly non-uniform. And in a lot of cases, neither side really seems to view them as being either binding or enforceable. I had an interesting exchange with Nikki the other day on Twitter regarding Digital Chaos and some of their arrangements. And she made the point to me, which I think is fair, that a lot of times in contract situations, players are breaching contract without, it seems, any consequences. Whereas when teams try to enforce contract clauses and try to prevent or penalize players from leaving, they tend to get vilified. I do think that there's a fair point somewhere in there. I think it probably is a symptom of the same underlying disease, but I do think that teams and players are all being hurt by this. It's not a matter of, oh, these evil organizations are exploiting or taking advantage of players. It's a matter of, we don't have the right infrastructure in place in the scene right now, and everybody is suffering as a result. So the big thing that I ask, again, it's kind of a basic thing in modern economics, is what are the incentives of each party at the negotiating table, and who is recognizing those players, helping them make progress toward those incentives within a particular legal or rules-based context. And really, the basic point is that there are a lot of people that are negotiating for players, at least ostensibly, whose interests may not always align with individual players. Okay, managers, for example, are a very good case. A lot of people confuse representing players for tournaments, as in playing conditions, as in rules fairness and disputes, with representing players in contract negotiations. Managers absolutely should be representing players when it comes to negotiating with tournaments and events. Managers representing players or looking after players' interests with contracts is very tricky. Managers are typically paid by the organization. Obviously, there's a lot of variation here, but in most cases, at least the incentive structures that I can see being reasonable, managers are going to be paid by the organization. It's not reasonable to view them as representative of individual players' interests in all cases. And this is not saying, again, when I'm talking about things like this as an economist, I'm not saying that anybody is evil or that anybody is out to get anybody else. The fundamental lesson of modern economics is that people respond to incentives, and when you place people in situations where those incentives are potentially conflicting, that's when people get hurt. The other case that I'll bring up as an example is, in some cases, it will tend to be the captain that negotiates on behalf of team members with an organization. This is fine in a lot of cases, but you always have to ask the question, what happens when someone leaves or is kicked and turns around and says, well, that particular contract that was negotiated for me by someone else, my team captain, is now really something that I don't want to abide by right now because it was made at a time when our interests were aligned. They're not aligned anymore, and there's something there that I didn't necessarily appreciate or that I didn't see, okay? You contrast this with other sports, and we'll do this as this video goes along. Players are represented by a collective bargaining agency and an individual agent or counsel. And this is going to be one of the big take-home points I'll make in this video, is that I think as a very minimum first step that we need to make sure that every individual player has at least some representation of their interests, in addition to the manager, in addition to the team or whoever, the team captain or whoever else. It's also worthwhile pointing out that the situation in Dota is different from other esports. So there is a possibility, if there's interest in this topic, I am teaching a sports economics electives class for the first time this spring. I'm thinking about some of these problems and some of this material anyway. There is a possibility that I may make some other videos on the economics and contract issues of esports in general It is important to point out, though, that Dota is different from other esports. Salaries are a much lower part of total player compensation in Dota compared to CSGO. Most of the money in Dota is coming from prize pools. And it's a very basic point, but it's important to realize it's very tricky in Dota to ask the question, is the team the employer? Okay? Obviously, when the team is paying a salary and that salary is most of what you're taking home at the end of the day, the employer-employee relationship between team and player is a lot more obvious and a lot more traditional. In this case, teams in Dota are acting more as a facilitator or as another negotiating party that is acting on the player's behalf rather than the traditional employer-employee relationship. It's actually, in some ways, the team is actually collectively, or the organization is actually a collective bargainer itself on the player's behalf. And this is very different even from other esports, as I said. So we've got some very different incentives and some different issues that I want to explore. And again, the amounts of money that we're starting to be talking about here are very, very large. We're going to get into, this isn't going to be an issue for TI in the same way it is for other tournaments, but it may well be for the majors. So we need to start thinking about this now. I do think that there need to be some centralized steps that need to be taken to address these issues. And the other thing, if you're not convinced by any of these other bullet points that this is an issue that absolutely must be addressed, the thing I worry about as an economist and somebody that's interested in the long-term growth of the industry is incentives for sponsors. So I've worried a lot in the past year that, for example, the tournament scene in Dota had gotten to the point where we're very unfriendly in some ways to third-party tournaments. I believe I've alluded to that in some of my other videos. I really worry with this secret thing. You look at a sponsor like NVIDIA. They are a sponsor that we want in this scene. They are one of the best companies in gaming right now to be hooked up with. And when you look at the way that NVIDIA gets painted in Envy's blog, it's probably not, I'm sure it wasn't Jackie's intention to go out and lambaste NVIDIA, but when they get dragged into something like this, where the responsibility arguably is not theirs at all, this is a very bad thing. This is a huge disincentive for them to invest in our scene. And remember, there's plenty of places right now in esports that a sponsor like NVIDIA can go. And this is why, if you're Turner or ESPN and you're thinking about a Dota 2 league, which is something I think we could really use right now, issues like this do play into your decision-making process. I think we need to address the current infrastructure in Dota 2 sooner rather than later, and I think it's going to be an issue if we don't. All right. It's a question I get asked, and I ask myself all the time, should Valve step in? Okay, so there are no easy answers here, okay? But most of the more straightforward answers involve Valve stepping in and acting as a central authority, like Riot does in League of Legends. And I don't think Riot's model is optimal either for our community for a number of reasons. That's almost a separate video in and of itself. But there's a question that gets asked all the time, should Valve act as a more centralized authority? Again, the problem is, it's not clear it's in their best interest to do so, all right? Part of the problem with looking at this as an economist is I'm not going to make a video and say, well, Valve should step in and solve everybody's problems if I'm looking at the problem and I'm saying to myself, gee, if I were an economist or a business consultant working for Valve, could I, in good faith, in their best interest, advise them that they should take steps in this direction? And the answer is not necessarily yes for a number of reasons, okay? So let's look at Valve versus Riot for a minute. Both of these are private companies, so we're going to try and look at some numbers. We're going to try and look at some market values, but it's important to say here that market capitalization cannot be directly computed for publicly traded shares for either of these companies. Riot's been bought, so we can at least take the transaction value as a sort of baseline, but again, there it's tricky because what they were worth a year or whatever ago when they were bought is not necessarily what they're worth now. Riot's estimated revenues in 2015 were about 1.6 billion, and most of this, it's not necessarily directly comparable to the number in the next line, but most of this is is related to League of Legends, okay? By the way, it's a little bit tricky. The sources in the slide, I'm going to try to at least give you some websites. You can Google this. I'm happy to provide the link in the comment, happy to provide the links to this in the video description. It's a little bit tricky because most of the time when you're looking for these numbers, what you're going to find is articles that are published that refer to superdataresearch.com, for example. Superdata itself is actually proprietary. You go on their website and they're asking you to sign up for their service. So you can't necessarily retrieve these numbers directly from their site. It really does make the comparison even more difficult, but I think there's at least some information content here, which is why I bothered with the slide. So Valve's estimated revenues, when you look at it on the surface, they're much lower, okay? Because Valve is estimating $238 million from Dota 2 and $221 million from CSGO in 2015. So very, very different, obviously. And it's easy to look at this and say, oh, well, Dota 2 is making much less money than League. Well, that's not necessarily true because, again, a lot of the cash flows in Dota aren't necessarily going directly through Valve and getting included, and if they do, they're not necessarily getting included directly in this number, okay? So when Dota 2 tournaments are held, right, a lot of the cash flows are being paid directly from the tournaments to teams. Valve's never seeing that money. It's not counted as a part of quote-unquote Dota 2 revenue, whereas Riot has much tighter control over League's competitive structure. A lot more of the money is getting funneled through them. They're not necessarily ending up with it, but it's easy for cash flows like that to end up in these kinds of revenue figures, especially when you're dealing with private companies and that aren't releasing balance sheets and income statements to public shareholders. So I don't necessarily believe the revenue gap between Dota and League is that big. It's big. It's probably at least a factor of 5. I don't know that it's a factor of 10. Okay. But the big point before we get lost in all this morass of details is this, and that's that if you look at Riot, almost all of their money is coming from League in some way or another. If you look at Valve, that is not the case. The total revenue from all games sold on Steam in 2015 was estimated at somewhere between $2.5 and $3 billion. All right, Valve's obviously only getting a cut of that. But when you look at the reasonable cuts that Valve is taking, it is pretty safe to say that Valve's revenue from overall sales of games on Steam is at least in the ballpark of what they're making from Dota. And when you add in the different fields that they're getting into, the VR field, for example, Steambox, Valve is getting money from a lot of different places. The incentive structure that Valve faces is very different from Riot. They are very different companies. It is not reasonable to say, okay, Valve should step in and do the same thing. That no business consultant right now would recommend, I think, to Valve that they step in and run Dota like Riot runs League. The company is just not set up to do that right now. And this is another thing, it's probably obvious to a lot of people, but I saw a tweet by Vlad the other day, and I know it was a joke, but he basically said, oh, you know, with all these new skin gambling allegations and the state putting pressure on Valve to do something about skin gambling, why doesn't Valve just buy the state? Well, you have to understand, Valve in the grand scheme of things is actually not that big a company, all right? Valve's market value, and it's probably a lot more now, but it was estimated at 2.5 to 3 billion total in 2012 to 13. And if you compare that to Microsoft, Boeing, Starbucks, through other Seattle companies, it's basically an order of magnitude less, all right? Valve may actually be worth somewhere in the upper range of 5 to 10 billion right now by some estimates. But again, it's a factor of at least 5 and more like 10 or 20 relative to some of these other companies that we're talking about. The other thing, by the way, when you look at Microsoft, Boeing, and Starbucks, this is another thing that I teach my undergraduate finance students, is that the conversion between revenue and market cap is very, very different for different firms. So when we're talking about Riot's revenues from League of Legends and Dota and Valve's revenues from Dota, and you're talking about, okay, what's the value of League as a franchise versus the value of Dota, it's not clear that those multiples are anywhere near the same as they would be, okay, when you're talking about revenue splits. I actually think the value of Dota as a franchise would be a little bit larger a percentage of the value of LoL than the revenue split would suggest, but maybe I'm just, economics fanboying there. The big thing is that Valve has a lot of other things on its plate, okay? Valve is already facing a lot of pressure from regulatory authorities over the fact that their platform Steam is getting used as a vehicle for skin betting, for example. That's the big issue that's facing them right now. The last thing as an advisor that I would tell Valve to do right now is to step in and take on more authority in a game where, again, it's not the same, it's not as prevalent as CSGO, but skins are being traded in Dota as well. The last thing I would tell them to do is to step in and to expose themselves to even more potential problems down the road when a lot of uncertainty over some of these betting sites has to fall out. It's not necessarily directly related, but I think when you add everything up, I don't think Valve is going to step in and solve all of our problems on this one. I really don't. In some ways, I hope I'm wrong. And it falls to us, it falls to members of the community, organizations, individual players, to try to think of solutions to what I think is a very systemic problem in the lack of professional standards and lack of professional infrastructure in our scene. So another question I get asked, does this affect the international or the majors? For TI, the answer is probably no. For majors, the answer may be yes. To my knowledge, and again, so as many of you know, I served as a complexities coach for TI6. When you registered as a player, manager, coach, whatever, for TI6, you did so through a website. And during this, you did through the TI registration or major registration website. And when you did this, the actual revenue split was visible, and I've had it confirmed now by several people that you get your payments straight through Steam. So the organization, at least for TI6, the organization never sees the cut of the prize pool that's designated toward the players. Those go directly from Valve through Steam into the players' bank accounts. Again, this is third party. I got paid by Complexity. We didn't end up getting any prize money from Valve. Kappa. But this is, again, what I've had confirmed through several people. Major prize payments work a little bit differently. They're actually handled through the organizer. It's actually the organizer that pays out prize money. PGL paid money directly through player accounts for two player accounts for the Manila Major. Again, this is what I've been told. Whereas payments for the Frankfurt and Shanghai Majors were actually made through ESL or, for example, to the organizations who then played the players. And this is how the majority of tournaments work. This is one of the problems that we're running into, okay? Again, we're in an environment right now where we have to worry about attracting third-party tournament organizers to the table. There's a lot with all of the majors. There's been a lot of crowding out. The Dota 2 scene is, in some ways, very unfriendly. It, in some ways, might be easier if all the tournaments paid players directly. But again, that is a non-trivial administrative cost. And and I say that because, among other things, laws are very different in different places across different countries about who you can pay and whether you have a responsibility to see that taxes are paid on that money, which end taxes get taken out of. People obviously are very concerned about getting taxed twice. It's not an easy problem, all right? So this is not necessarily, oh, well, we just adopt a professional standard that says all tournaments pay individual players directly. I think in some cases that might help, but I also don't want people to come out of this saying, oh, well, we should just make tournaments do this. This is something that it's irresponsible of them not to do. I actually do not think that is the case. Now, later on, maybe we can achieve this in some limited cases. I'm going to lay out maybe my case for that, but we'll get there when we get there. Okay, so what about a union? This is another topic that people raise. So first of all, really dumb economist pet peeve. Call it a players association, okay? Not a union. Again, most people don't care. Me, economist, union is a particular legal term that has specific meanings in different places, and those meanings are different, can be different depending on where in the world you live. In the US, it can even different. The legal definition, obligations of a union, and rights of the workers vis-a-vis the union are actually different depending on even what state you're in. So be careful with that term union. I prefer just players association. But let's talk a minute about how would a players association work. So when you look at other professional sports, you look at the MLB, NFL, NBA. We'll talk a little bit. I actually think down the line, I'm not as familiar with, but I think there's actually a lot to be learned in thinking about the PGA and the ATP, golf and tennis. But the idea in MLB and NFL, the major leagues in North America, is that these players associations are collective bargaining representatives for the players, and their primary role is to represent players' interests in negotiations with the league, whose interests are represented by an owners association and or the commissioner's office. So the adversarial structure there is a lot more clear. You have the league or commissioner's office advocating for the owners, where you have the union or the players association advocating for the players. And the result of this is collective bargaining agreements that do a lot of things. They outline restrictions that are made on individual contracts. So they outline league minimum salaries, for example. They restrict the compensation structures that can be provided by these contracts. You can't hire a guy and pay and promise to pay him, $1 billion if they win the World Series and $1 if you don't, for example. It is important though, okay? A lot of the problems that we're talking about in Envy's blog are not necessarily going to be solved by a players association. So people shouldn't necessarily say, okay, well, we need some kind of a union and that's going to solve the problem. Remember, players' interests in these sports leagues are represented by a union, but they're also represented by individual agents and legal representation. When a player is negotiating a contract, for example, with their individual team, that contract negotiation is typically done by an individual player representative, not a collective bargaining agency. Now, of course, that's a very blanket statement, and the mechanics of this differ from case to case as they differ from league to league. But in broad terms, these are different negotiating problems, and they're handled by different entities. So one of the points that I'm going to make in this video is I think the first minimum step is just to have some basic level of individual player representation be the minimum standard. We can talk about a union or a players association at some point, but I think it's a much more complicated problem, and I actually don't even know that it would solve a lot of the issues that have come up in some of the recent drama. The big question among other things, the big question that we need to address before we talk about a union or association is, where does its authority come from and what is it supposed to do, okay? For reasons that we talked about on a previous slide, Valve stepping in and forcing everybody to listen to some kind of centralized players association, I just don't know that that's realistic, at least not in the short term. And the negotiating problems when you talk about negotiating an individual player's compensation from the team and negotiating with tournaments as far as rules and playing conditions, a lot of times those get lumped together by certain players when they talk about, we want people representing our interests, but those are very different incentive-based problems, all right? So and again, when we talk about CSGO versus LoL versus Dota, the primary function of a union is actually much more obvious in League of Legends. So in League of Legends, you have Riot's interests represented by Riot. You have organizations whose roles are very, very defined. They buy into the LCS structure, and it's a much more streamlined and centralized strategic situation. It's actually a lot more similar to what we see in traditional North American sports leagues. In Dota, it's kind of the Wild West. Things are not relationships between organizations and players and tournaments are determined mostly on a case-by-case basis. It's actually not obvious currently what role such a union or players association would solve and how it would enforce its decisions, all right? it's kind of complicated. And again, I'm thinking about talking about this in my class this spring, and I may do another video on it. When you talk about designing a players association in Dota, it would probably actually need to be modeled first after the ATP or the PGA, where you talk about a centralized structure that puts together a schedule of tournaments and facilitates, or sort of regulates is the wrong word, but I'll use it anyway, players playing in each event, and the prize money, and some sort of centralized ranking system that determine which players are eligible to participate in which events and how events get ranked. I think you need to take that, but again, the situation is much more complicated because the ATP and PGA are composed of, the competitive units are individual players rather than teams. And that makes a big difference in terms of strategic incentives. So you do actually need to look at what the MLBPA and NFLPA do in terms of representing players in a team concept. Of those, I think in some ways the MLBPA has been the most successful in terms of advancing and representing players' interests, but there are things to be learned from the other two leagues as well. TLDR, it's quite a complicated problem, and I get a little bit triggered when every time something like this comes up, and I see on Twitter, we should just have a players union that would solve everything. That's actually not the case. It's not obvious at all how you go about creating such an entity. It's a project that I might take up in the future, and there's a lot to it. Okay, so all right, I've rambled on enough. What are my actual suggestions in all this? So very, very basic. Okay, first of all, there needs to be professional standards, and there need to be individual player representatives, and that needs to be something that becomes standard at least in the top 15 to 20 teams on an ongoing basis. Okay, we need salaries, guys. Players playing under an organization should have written contracts, and they should receive at least some level of basic nominal salary. All right, and this is going to be it's going to be an ongoing theme throughout this slide that both sides, I'm going to say, players should receive this. Both sides are going to have to give something up. One of the things, for example, that I see putting a lot of pressure on this going forward is, I think it probably ought to be the case that all 5 players always receive an equal share of tournament prizes. Although again, when you're talking about a negotiated process, a lot of things are going to have to go on the table. I think we're going to have to go away from the idea that, all 5 players should receive the same base salary or benefits. One of the things, for example, that you saw happen in the NBA, right at kind of the beginning of this current generation, when the LeBron Jameses and Dwayne Wades and Carmelo Anthonys were sort of coming into the league and getting big, the NBA strengthened or rearranged its salary cap a little bit to restrict the size. In particular, they restricted the size of individual player contracts. They said, okay, this is a max contract, and you can't pay an individual player beyond this point. And as a result, you tell LeBron James, okay, you can't make more than X dollars playing for any team, not just Cleveland. All right. And what he says is, gee, I know I'm worth a lot more to a team than this maximum salary that I would get paid. So I'm going to look to maximize my revenues or my financial gains through other channels. And the most obvious channel that you can think of is you win a title. That gets you a lot of sponsorship money. It gets you a lot of visibility. Your jersey sales go off the charts in China and elsewhere in the world. So you get this problem where NBA players chase titles, because guess what? When you restrict people's salary, or it isn't there, they maximize their total financial compensation in other ways. I actually think that part of this is the problem with a lot of the roster stability. You have a lot of players making nominal or no salaries. Those salaries, even when they're there, are a negligible fraction of player prize pools. So how do the best players in the world maximize their own gain? They go out and they constantly swap teams chasing those titles. Whether or not this is a successful strategy, okay, and this is something that I've used a lot in the last couple of years, is you have to remember, When Dwayne Wade and LeBron James and Chris Bosh all got together in Miami, they didn't win a title in their first season. And I remember that NBA season, the rhetoric, they made it to the playoffs, they played pretty well. The rhetoric was, oh, this team is going to be a failure after one season, all right? In Dota, the way it is right now, similar setbacks happen and the team disbands, all right? So in many ways, in Dota, it's even worse. And I think the idea that players get a salary, have written contracts, that by itself is going to promote a lot of stability. All contracts, it needs to be a professional standard. All contracts should be reviewed by a legal representative of the individual player. So there's a lot of talk that I hear about agents, all right? This doesn't need to be expensive, okay? Think about buying a house. For those of you who haven't, when you buy a house, okay, at some point you basically have an attorney look over. There are attorneys for both the buyer and seller that are legally required to look over and sign off on the contracts that you sign when you buy a house. This is required for everybody's legal protection. It doesn't cost a ton of money as a proportion of value of the total transaction. And again, when people are saying, oh, well, this is just too expensive. I mean, no players make enough that this would be justified. When you go back and you start talking about Misery being owed $200,000, like, that's a lot of money. And the cost of getting a lawyer to spend one billable hour looking over a contract that you would sign with a team, I mean, is that justified in order to avoid the risk of not getting paid $200,000? I think it is. We're not talking about hiring Scott Boras. And there's a lot of, again, similar to unions, there is a lot of talk about, well, what would agent relationships look like going forward? And should Dota players have agents? I actually think the answer to that is probably yes. We're getting to the point very quickly in esports where I think it's going to make sense for individual players to be represented by agents. And I think the fact that a lot of professional sports franchises are buying into esports right now, the fact that Turner's bought into esports, it's not an accident, okay? And I hear a lot of people, this is just a general pet peeve, I hear a lot of people saying things like, well, esports is totally different. Well, you can't compare esports to professional sports. Guys, yes, you can, okay? The incentives and the economic problems in esports are different. But saying that there's nothing to be learned from decades and decades of watching the similar incentive problems in various areas of professional sports it's dumb, okay? It's a dumb statement. The other thing is regular exchange of information needs to be a professional standard. So there does need to be some statement that goes from the team to the individual players. And that ought to be a part. Players, I'm looking at you. When you are talking about signing a contract, part of that contract ought to be, I want to see some kind, and I'm not talking about being Navi a year or two ago or whoever it was that said, oh, players should have full access to the team and organization's books. That's ridiculous, okay? In business, very few individual employees have anything like that. And if you ask most employers about that, you'd either be committed or fired or both. But I do think that there needs to be some sort of reasonable exchange about, okay, every month, here's a statement of the revenue that the organization earned or was paid, and here's a statement of where it's going. Here's when you can expect to be paid. And again, it kind of, in the same vein as contracts, I want written documents, okay? I want people, there's a lot of debate every time something about this happens, okay? People point out to me that, oh, you don't need written contracts because in different parts of the world, this is accepted as a contract and this is accepted as evidence of agreement. It's fine to sign it's fine to have agreements made via text or Skype. It's fine to have contracts signed by email. A lot of the times they're right. It is fine, okay? At the end of the day, though, when you talk about enforcing these agreements and you talk about court, all right, a binding contract is what a judge says it is. And my approach is always that I like my odds best, always, when I'm walking up to that bench with a signed and notarized piece of paper rather than a screenshot or a printout, okay? This is not to say that email in particular is routinely honored by courts of law as evidence of binding business agreements. But again, I want a paper trail. I think that part of the professional infrastructure that we need to evolve is the idea that more of these things are documented and that documentation is available to both parties and visible to both parties. Okay, again, team's interest, all right? I'm talking about players, I'm talking about benefits or things that players should expect from a team. Teams have the right to expect things from players as well. One of the things that we talk about in Envy's blog is this idea that there was this big streaming deal with Panda TV that fell apart because one of the players did not fulfill individual obligations. Guys, if you expect teams to be treated fairly, there are going to be clauses in these contracts that impose penalties on players when they do something, okay? That's an unavoidable part of the thing. Again, as Sajidin pointed out the other day on Twitter, teams right now, it's sort of the phenomenon of the evil organization. When there's a dispute between the fact that we're relying on Reddit for conflict resolution is ridiculous enough in itself. But when there's a dispute between a player and a team, and a player and a team tries to enforce a contract, she's right that it's usually the team that ends up taking the PR hit. Okay. At the end of the day, I actually think it is very, very important in order to change that everything be documented and that players have responsibilities and that they be held to those responsibilities as well. A lot of players are going to chafe at the idea of signing a contract that says that you have to stream up to X hours a week, that you have to be available for travel arrangements, you have to make public appearances, blah, blah, blah. Well, number one, certain top teams are already doing that. Okay, it is going to be a standard if you expect to be an elite competitor. And number two, again, having all of this visible on paper, I know it's intimidating as somebody that's never necessarily had a long-term professional job or signed a big contract like this. It's intimidating when somebody comes with you a piece of paper and says, agree to XYZ. It feels like you're signing your life away. Okay, but that contract exists for the protection of both sides. That's the big point when you look at contract economics. It's the thing that, the Nobel Prize just got awarded for, guys, okay? Contracts exist and can increase welfare for both sides of the agreement. I actually think there's been a lot of exchange about this. I actually think players should expect to give a prize pool cut to the primary sponsor or organization in most cases. Among other things, because it's going to be the manager that is going to be representing the team collectively in negotiating with individual events, facilitating travel, even talking with sponsors, coordinating appearances. It makes sense from an incentive point of view for that manager to be an employee of the primary sponsor or team. And so if nothing else, you're going to have a cut of the primary prize pool that goes to the manager getting paid. And yes, I do think when we talk about managers and coaches, I do think that they should get a cut of the prize pool. They're working too, okay? And honestly, if you're in a situation where the players are saying, well, this guy isn't qualified, this guy isn't competing or playing, why should he get a percentage of the prize pool? I think either that's immature or that person is in a situation where they're not getting a manager that is doing all the jobs that a manager can do. All right. I may be biased from talking to Charlie and a lot of other people and beef about just how much managers do in terms of facilitating players' lives. This is a full-time job now, guys. These players need a lot of things done so that they can spend their time playing Dota and they can spend their time grinding and improving, okay? They don't want to have to be worrying about booking plane tickets. They don't want to have to be worrying about their bank accounts. Again, going back to the financial statement standards, okay? And again, contract termination conditions or penalty clauses, the expectation on both sides needs to be that these are enforced, okay? We can't keep using social media and Reddit as our primary vehicle for conflict resolution in the scene. It is extraordinarily destabilizing, and it's extraordinarily scary to people and organizations that otherwise might be putting money in our scheme. If it is feasible, and this is, again, I would have to know a little bit more about Valve's situation in order to tell you whether it is. I would love to see third-party tournaments adopt the same payment convention as Valve. And if there would be one thing that I think Valve could step in and do, it would be to offer some of these. Offer the ability to make some of these payments through the Steam system, so that the prize pools, especially for example, if there are crowd-funded portions of the prize pool, have those cash flows feed directly into the Steam client and get paid according to pre-agreed upon prize pool splits. In the same way that TI does. Okay, that's one thing that I could see doing. I don't. Again, I don't expect Valve to step in and solve everybody's problems, but right now, Valve functionally does not recognize teams as an entity. And when TI invites go out, for example, they go out to 5-player rosters. They don't go out to your organization doesn't get invited to TI. Your 5 players get invited or subs get invited to TI. And Valve has had a philosophy for a very long time, which I admire, of putting the players first, okay? Of considering player interest first and foremost. I actually worry that in many ways that's hurting the players, because the lack of any kind of uniform professional standards about the player-team relationship is, in my opinion, exactly what leads to a lot of these situations in the past with tournaments not paying out and now with individual teams not paying out. We got to recognize that, guys, not everything in esports is going to do things like we do in Dota, and you can't necessarily ask everybody that comes in to play by our rules, all right? I do think that there needs to be some support on Valve's end for the player-team relationship. It can be as simple, for example, as facilitating the payout of tournament cash flows. There are some other things that we can talk about if you guys are interested. But again, this is the area where I think Valve stepping in, at least doing a little, could help stabilize things a lot. So probably took a little bit longer than I planned when recording this video. Again, these are preliminary thoughts. These are a lot of issues. I'm thinking about these issues and still prepping a lot as a part of this class I'm going to teach in the spring. If you guys want to hear more about this or similar issues, even in other areas of esports, I'm definitely open to suggestions. Hope you guys have enjoyed listening, and I will talk to you soon.